Welcome to the lesson on navigation. When we're flying an airplane, we need to be able to determine where we are at any point in time and which way to go to get to our destination. On the way to our destination, we want to make sure that we avoid obstacles and that we avoid airspace that we don't have permission to enter. In some cases, we can accomplish that simply by following landmarks on the ground that are easy to identify. Sometimes there aren't such landmarks, so we need to use something like deduced reckoning or radio navigation. GPS technology has dramatically simplified navigation, and that's what pilots usually use now, but we need to be careful not to become over-reliant on GPS. In this lesson, I'm going to go over several different types of navigation, starting with pilotage, then talking about deduced reckoning, which is often referred to as dead reckoning, then VOR navigation, and finally GPS navigation. Pilotage is simply navigation by reference to landmarks. The landmarks we'll want to use show up on sectional charts. For example, roads. Divided highways are usually pretty easy to spot and to identify. Single-lane roads can be useful in rural enough areas. In busy areas, a single-lane road is too difficult to tell from other single-lane roads. Railroad tracks make good landmarks. Power lines are often useful as landmarks. Lakes with unique shapes are useful in areas that have a lot of lakes. If there aren't a lot of lakes, then they don't even have to be unique shapes in order to be able to identify them. Cities are usually pretty easy to identify. We can't usually identify from the air what city we're going over, but we can often tell when we're going over an area with more dense population. And then other landmarks, like in this case a speedway, that is pretty easy to identify from the air. As we travel to our destination, it's important to make sure that we don't run into anything. That's the biggest risk when we fly at night or if we fly in low visibility conditions. But there are some types of obstructions that are difficult to see even in the middle of the day. The most common thing that aircraft collide with is the Earth. To make it a little easier to find areas of high terrain, the terrain is depicted on the sectional charts using colors that indicate the elevation of the terrain. Towers are shown on sectional charts if they're above a certain height, and there's two numbers indicated next to each tower. The first number is the altitude above mean sea level of the peak of the tower. The second number, which is in parentheses, is the height of the tower above the surrounding ground. It's not usually the tower itself that airplanes run into. When airplanes run into a tower, it's usually the support wires around the tower because those are extremely difficult to see. Within each latitude and longitude box on the sectional chart, there's a number that indicates the mean sea level altitude that's just a little bit higher than the highest obstruction within that box. In this example, the large 2 and the small 4 indicate that if you cruise at an altitude of 2,400 feet, you should be above any obstruction within that latitude-longitude box. In some regions, there really aren't enough good landmarks for you to navigate solely by reference to landmarks. So in that case, we need to use something like deduced reckoning. Deduced reckoning refers to making a calculation of what magnetic heading you need to fly to take you to the destination. And you account for wind as they're predicted and magnetic variation. Then you just fly that heading. Details of how to do that calculation will be covered in the lesson on flight planning. Since wind forecasts are not perfect and there are some other errors that creep in, deduced reckoning is best used in combination with some other form of navigation. For example, you might want to use deduced reckoning to go over a region with no landmarks if you're going to be good landmarks once you get past that area that will allow you to figure out how far off course you are. One example of deduced reckoning was Charles Lindbergh's flight across the Atlantic. He knew that when he got out over the North Atlantic that there weren't going to be any landmarks that would tell him where he was. So he carefully calculated the magnetic heading that he needed to fly at different points along the course, counting on the fact that when he got to the coast of England, he'd be able to find something that would help him determine where along the coast he had crossed so that he could make a correction and correct his route to Paris. So let's talk about how to make those course corrections. The actual course that you end up following may be a little different than that line that you drew on your sectional for several reasons. As we mentioned, the wind might not be what the wind forecast predicted. Your true airspeed might not be what your pilot's operating handbook predicted. You may have intentionally diverted because you saw something a little ways off to the side that you thought would be interesting to go take a closer look at, or air traffic control may have asked you to fly a particular heading for some of that time. So when you get to a point where you have landmarks or some other information that allows you to calculate how far you are off your course, you need to calculate a revised heading that will take you to your destination. You do that based on the distance remaining to your destination. A rule of thumb is that you should make a course change of 1 degree for every mile off course you are at 60 miles away from the destination. So if you're more than 1 mile off course, then you make bigger corrections. If your distance to the destination is less than 60 miles, then you increase the correction angle proportionately to that. So if you were 20 miles from the destination and 1 mile off course, you would do a 3 degree heading change. Now, if the reason that you're off course at that point is something that's likely to continue, then you also want to make a correction based on the distance that you've already traveled. Because obviously the course that you were doing wasn't taking you in quite the direction you thought it was. Let's work through a course correction example. Suppose that you're on a flight to a destination that's 90 miles away, and at 60 miles into that flight, you cross a landmark, and based on where you cross that landmark, you can determine that you are 2 miles to the left of the ground track that you had planned. So you need to make a course correction of 2 degrees to the right based on the fact that you are 2 miles off course after 60 miles. So that correction counteracts whatever error has been happening up to that point and revises your course so that you'll basically be going parallel to your planned course. course, you don't just want to go parallel to your planned course. You want to make a further correction so that you get back on your course line by the time you get to your destination. So with 2 miles off course and 30 miles remaining, that would indicate a right turn of an additional 4 degrees. Let's move now to radio navigation. The FAA knowledge test always seems to be one generation of technology behind the technology that pilots are currently using. So even though most pilots are now using GPS, VOR navigation is still available. There's still VOR stations out there, and you will need to know how to do it to pass the knowledge test. If the aircraft that you use for your practical test has a VOR receiver, you'll also be expected to know how to use that receiver when you take your practical test. VOR stands for Very High Frequency Omnidirectional Range. This picture shows a VOR station. They're usually, or sometimes they're located at airports, other times they're located just out in a field a ways away from airports. When you have your navigation radio tuned to a VOR station, your radio can determine what direction the airplane is from the station. VOR navigation is optimized for navigating either directly to the VOR station or from the VOR station to another direction. It's not optimized for going airport to airport. So this picture shows what a VOR station looks like on your sectional chart. At the location of the VOR station, there is a symbol. There's a couple variations on this symbol to indicate different types of VOR stations. Some of them have some additional capability beyond the VOR capability, and they get a different symbol. But for this purpose, we'll treat them the same. Next to that symbol, there's an information block. It includes the frequency for the station and an identifier for the station. So in this case, the frequency is 116.6. You would enter that frequency into your nav radio, and then if you listen to the broadcast signal, it will broadcast a Morse code identifier, and the Morse code is printed out on the sectional here, and you can verify that you actually have tuned in the correct VOR receiver that way. Surrounding the VOR station is a compass rose. So this compass rose is very helpful for figuring out what direction various things are from the VOR station. So when your navigation radio determines what direction you are from the VOR station, it doesn't just display that number on an indicator. Instead, that number is communicated to the pilot through a VOR indicator like the one pictured here. The VOR indicator has a bearing indicator which around the perimeter of it, which rotates. The pilot rotates it by turning a little knob called the Omni Bearing Selector. It's important to understand that the bearing that is indicated on the bearing indicator is not information coming from the radio to the pilot. This is a setting by the pilot to the indicator. The next piece is a to from flag, which it says to when flying at the indicated bearing if you flew that direction from your current location, if that would take you closer to the station. On the other hand, if it would take you farther from the station, it will say from. Sometimes it will have a X symbol or an off symbol to indicate that the signal from the VOR station is not usable at the moment. The last piece of the VOR indicator is the course deviation indicator. That's this bar that moves left and right, and that tells you where the course is relative to you if you were looking in the direction indicated by the bearing indicator. So if you were facing at 310 degrees, the way this is set right now, this course indicator would tell you that the course that goes at 310 degrees to the station would be to your left. The way you use this VOR indicator depends on what you're trying to do, and we'll work through a couple different examples of different things you can do with your VOR indicator. First, let's assume that you just want to figure out what direction you are from the VOR station. First, you rotate the OBS until the to from flag switches to from. This was already on from. And then keep turning it until the course deviation indicator is centered. At that point, the bearing indicator indicates which radial you're currently on. So this is telling you that you are on the 150 degree radial from the station. So you're southeast, more south from the station. That doesn't provide any information about how far you are away from the station. So if you want to know how far from the station you are, you need to get other information from some other source, like a landmark or another VOR station or some other radio aid. So next, let's talk about how you would use it if your goal is to navigate from wherever you are directly to the VOR station. You start by rotating the OBS until the to flag indicator says to, and the course deviation indicator is centered. You want it to say to since you're trying to fly to the station. At that point, the bearing indicator will tell you what course you want to fly in order to get to the station. So you need to choose a heading that will take you on that course, accounting for the wind. So if there's wind from the left, you'll fly a little left of that heading in order to travel as close as you can to that 210 direction. If, as you're flying towards the station, the course deviation drifts off center, then you turn toward the needle. So if the needle starts to deflect off to the left, then you'll make a slight left turn to try and bring it back toward the center. As you get close to the station, it gets very sensitive and it gets very difficult to keep that needle centered. And then as you pass over the station, the to from indicator will change from to saying from. That's when you know that you've passed directly over the station. So let's say the next leg on your trip is from that VOR station that you just passed over to an airport. So the first step is to look at the sectional chart and determine what radial that airport is on. Let's say that it's on the 200 degree radial. So we rotate the OBS to 200 degrees. When we do that, it would be common for the course deviation indicator to deflect. Then we turn to the heading that will result in us traveling 200 degrees. Again, accounting for wind. And anytime that course deviation indicator is off center, we want to turn toward the needle and try to bring it back. So one of the ways that the FAA tests this information on the knowledge test is to show you a VOR indicator and then ask you which of several positions might you be in, and have the VOR indicator show what it's showing. Now you can't twist the OBS because it's just a piece of paper, so you have to just read it based on what it currently says. So the way you would accomplish this is first look at the bearing indicator, and it's showing east, and the to from indicator is showing to. That tells us that from our current location, flying east would take us closer to the station. So we can eliminate choice A and choice D based on that information, because from those places flying east would take us away from the station. Now we should imagine the course that it's trying to have us fly. If you have east selected and the bearing in 2, it's trying to take you on the course indicated by this blue line. So we know from the course deviation indicator that if we're facing east, that course would be on our left. So that would be true at location B. At C, if we were facing east, then the target course would be on our right. So we know that that's not the right answer. So B would be the right answer to this test question. So that brings us up to the modern day in global positioning system navigation. I only have one slide on GPS navigation because it is so much easier to use and simpler that there isn't really nearly as much to say about it as there was VOR navigation. So a global positioning system receiver can determine its location based on satellite signals. You don't really need to understand how it does that. You don't even need to tune in those satellite signals. The system knows where the satellites are and how to tune them in. You just turn the system on and it figures out where it is. There are different types of displays. You can have a GPS system feed a display like the VOR display if you choose to, but the most common way of displaying it is with a moving map. Basically, the GPS system, in addition to knowing where you are, has a database, so it knows where a lot of other things are, and it draws a map with all those other things and shows an icon representing your plane relative to those other things. You also enter in what course you're intending to fly, and that course will show up on the map, usually as a magenta line. So you can just look at this map and see an icon of your airplane and see at a glance whether you are to the left of the line or to the right of the line and by how far. If you have ADS-B in technology in your aircraft, then you may get a lot of extra information shown on this moving map besides your own location. You may have the locations of other airplanes, and you may have radar information. The information about other airplanes is extremely useful, but you need to be careful not to be too reliant on it, because aircraft that don't have ADS-B out won't show up, and so you need to keep looking out the windows and looking for traffic still. and the radar information tends to be 10 to 20 minutes old by the time it's showing on your display. So that concludes the lesson on navigation. There's a few things that I recommend you talk to with your flight instructor to help you put this information to use during your training. First thing, I recommend that you get out a sectional chart that covers the region where you're going to be doing your training and talk about what types of landmarks tend to be useful in your part of the country. Ask your instructor what type of radio navigation equipment is installed in the airplane that you're going to be using for training. Whatever type of radio aids are there, you'll be expected to know how to use them. And if your training aircraft does have a GPS system installed, ask if you can borrow the user's manual so you can become proficient at using it. So you'll need to know how to enter your route. You'll need to know how to change what features get showed on the moving map so that the map doesn't get overly cluttered. And you can learn those. How you do those things varies from system to system, but it's in the user's manual. And oftentimes the user manual is available online, so you won't even need to take a copy from your flight school.